I would like to now introduce Andrew Leach, who is a professor of architecture history at the Queensland University of Technology and a professorial fellow of the University of Sydney. He's mostly known for his work on Manfredo Tafuri. His books include Manfredo Tafuri, Choosing History from 2007, What is Architecture History from 2010, and Crisis on Crisis from 2015. And here with Luca Scansi, here present, he works precisely on this edition of early writings by Tafuri entitled From Crisis to Commitment, forthcoming with the MIT Press. So welcome, Andrew. You're in Australia, so I know you're both talking from very far away. So just feel free to start.
Thank you, Jana. Can I just confirm that you can hear me okay?
Yes, we hear you very well.
Okay, thank you. I must make, well, first some thanks, then an apology. Thank you, Jana, for the invitation to contribute to this program. I certainly wish, as Luca did, that we would be able to join you in Prague for coffee and everything else. I must apologize to the speakers who follow me that I need to leave, almost before discussion time to catch my last train home. So forgive me if I go a little fast and catch up some time as I go. I don't have any images, but I'll try and keep it lively. Luca, if we need something to look at, we could also look at the slide of La Mano sulla Città. I think that would be a fun thing to have in the background. As was the case for Luca, I've been asked to speak to Tafuri's Marxism, sometimes through and sometimes against the grain of some of his best-known conversations across time and geography with writers whose stance was similarly progressive, though, as Luca has made clear, hardly consistent. Grazie. With the time available, I would like to locate this problem within a fairly straightforward reading of one essay and an observation, hardly original, that Tafuri was something of a methodological bowerbird, constantly testing the usefulness of the observations of one author or another for his conception of the tasks of architectural history. This could be no more obvious than in his reflections on method across the 1970s, underpinned by a bibliography that changed markedly over the course of the decade. Following the moment of disciplinary clarity, from which Teoria Storia dell'Architettura is published in 1968, but before the stock-taking of La Sfera del Labirinto, published in 1980, and the source indeed for your coffee code. This latter work gathered within its covers and behind his somewhat post-rationalized piece on Il Progetto Storico, essays penned from the end of the 1960s until the end of the 1970s. Within this long decade, one of his more awkward essays, not included in this volume, stands out for its attempt at a kind of programmatic clarity with regards to the tools employed by the historian of architecture towards ends that Tafuri had already clarified in the 1960s. They are worked up across the 1970s into something less bound to the Roman scene described by Luca than to Venice, where his voice was given an institutional imprimatur. In their broad strokes, which I'll recall or try to, they were something of a constant across his career, even if manifest through a wide range of works and figures, and in a style of writing subject to, and in a mode of writing subject to stylistic inflection, depending on what he was reading and who he was trying to impress. While there is much that we could talk about, for its explicit attention to the themes of today's program, I want to consider an essay published in 1975 in the journal Arte Veneta, entitled Architettura e Storiografia, Architecture and Historiography, un proposto di un metodo, a proposal for a method. It is a piece that is easily overlooked, although I'm pleased to read that, or to hear rather, that it's been anthologized in English translation in the forthcoming book Order and Disorder by Pier Vittorio Aureli and his team at Lausanne. But following its publication in 1975, this essay was quickly overshadowed by the much more widely read Il Progetto Storico, published 2 years later in Casabella, and which was prominently translated, including in oppositions soon thereafter. I'm getting ahead of myself, though. What I want to say is that it's fair to say that few writers activated the progressive imagination in architecture as much as Tafuri did for those reading him in the 1970s and 80s. Even if I believe his ideas continue to hold water, despite the problems that gather around them, they now read more decidedly as products of their moment, if anything, as models for how to locate architecture in discourses formed elsewhere, rather than as something that one should imitate. There is at work both a simple base superstructure diagram in which architecture is inevitably not real and circumscribed by ideology, and battling with technical fields that approach reality in service of capitalist development. And La Management Solicita serves us pretty well as an exemplification of that. As well as an adaptation in particular after 1966 of Mario Tronti's concept of a critica dell'ideologia, critique of ideology, as a responsibility both of the architect seeking to affect the world beyond architecture and of the critic historian as the agent best placed to hold architecture to account for its actions. His most widely read missive, Prototypia of 1973, modeled this figure's work in action as it constructed a persuasive 2-century-long historical arc based on the premise of architecture's definitive departure from the conditions shaping capitalist development from the 18th century to his own. That book also arguably documents a writer struggling to absorb and activate a library that he had encountered after his formation as a critic and antagonist, not so definitive in the debates recounted by Luca, but necessary for his integration with the group of students he encountered at Venice, and who would form the first generation of his assistants when he took a position there. He arguably follows the contours of this library a bit too faithfully, its language clearly borrowed rather than internalized, in many cases that is, and reconciled with those other things that he'd read up to the mid-1960s, and which formed the deeper structure of his positions. Again, Luca has laid this out very clearly. I read a lot of his work in the 1970s in the same vein. I don't think I'm giving anything away by saying that I recognize very well the signs of somebody writing competently but out of their depth. But this exploration was essential to his process of identifying the tools that might attend to the tasks, tools and tasks always, to the tasks that he set for himself and for his discipline of the history of architecture. And this recurs in the essay Architettura e Historiography. Tafuri wrote this essay after his first encounters with the landscape of American architectural theory in the 1970s, and belongs, I think, to his efforts to reconcile the philosophical and semiological currents that he found there with the problems and sources that were already on his desk. I think it fair to describe this piece as a tether to older terms of engagement, while exploring how these might adapt to new institutional conditions, the staffage of their authority, and their overlapping vocabularies. This indeed is where his essay begins, with a complaint about the new proliferation of studies on architectural signification. Historians, he asserts, need to challenge the fashionable aspects of this theme as part of a radical rethinking of language as a much longer leitmotif in the history of architecture, and of course on which Teoria Storia dell'Architettura, and on which in Teoria Storia was a synonym for architecture's interior concerns, the basis, that is, for its autonomy. The wealth of an architectural language, he writes, and I quote, by no means coincides with the historical relevance of works themselves, close quote. Beyond the systems of meaning and signification that one might reconstruct and locate in place and time, are those now unrecoverable meanings that are latent but hidden, and no less loaded with meaning than those languages, again, that speak directly to historians, and through historians to contemporary architects. How many times, he asks, has a failed work, an unrealized effort, or a fragment posed problems that are otherwise hidden by the finished quality of those works which have risen to the dignity of texts, close quote. The historian, he says, has something of a choice to make, and I'm paraphrasing here, to set a work within its signifying systems, or to recover its historical complexities, signifying systems or historical complexities, which is to say its languages and mentalities in the most expansive sense beyond architecture itself. The historian, as he puts it, is thus the intermediary between that which is known and knowable from the present being one kind of reality, with which architecture maintains a circumscribed distance as a discipline, and that which has passed as a recoverable reality, which may be approximated, if not fully recovered, with history's tools. For Tafuri, the mythology of the modern movement remains the strongest evidence in support of this historiographical mission, and the clearest case for the historian's role in architectural culture. I'm going to skip over a long quotation in the interests of time. Whatever prejudices the historian brings to their subject, he argues, they are responsible for accounting for architectural activity in all of its intellectual and practical dimensions, as well as for the instability that is inherent to the work itself and to the work of recovering it historiographically. On one hand, he writes, this work of recovery must be ready to describe the processes describing the concrete face of projective invention, that is, the autonomy of linguistic choices and their historical function as a chapter in a general history of intellectual labor and its modes of reception. I'm continuing this long quotation. And on the other, so a history of architecture within a general history of intellectual labor, and on the other, it must sit within the general history of the structures and productive relations and be made to react to the development of abstract labor, close quote. The history of architecture, in other words, is part of the history of capitalist development, in which architecture has agency through the autonomy claimed by the architect, and in which it substantiates and exemplifies processes over which, conversely, it has no control of its own. For Tafuri, to speak of these two tasks is to acknowledge a series of intersecting premises: the project as an intellectual construct, the real conditions of architectural production, and modes of consumption by architects of architecture and by the world of its fabric. Each juncture these paths cross confronts the historian with a series of analytical limitations that themselves demand analysis. Regardless of the historian's own pursuits, be it framed by something traditional like iconological analysis, or something emancipatory and following sociopolitical lines, and these are Tafuri's two examples, the object of study itself will always have something else to say. The critical act he proposes is one of remontage, elevating both the content and nature of those fragments that survive the past as historical evidence. He puts as one target of this work a confrontation with what he calls the magic circle of language, and hence the basis of the way meaning is constructed in the present. Another is the recovery of that same language's historical function, for which the work of architecture is merely a starting point. The historian can revisit all of the, as he puts it, extra-linguistic spheres that we might bring to bear upon a work, quoting him to say exploding historical linguistic structures in all of their profundity, but be just as easily left with materials that are still primed for reconstruction, more or less arbitrary, even if they can be known fragment by surviving fragment in their own terms. And he hasn't read them, of course, because they're yet to be published, but the lines by Ginsberg and Prosperi, with which he famously begins Il Progetto Storico, say much the same thing, hence the resonance that he finds in these lines with which he begins that famous essay. One is readily trapped if one begins with the wrong intentions, ending up down a well in which meaning is determined within clearly defined limits and tested within the bounds of that system. And one therefore never needs to encounter reality in order to make sense to oneself. This is, as he puts it, a charming deception to which history is always subject. His readiest example is a history of architecture from the Renaissance to constructivism, written as a history of space. His target is not very well hidden, let me say. It's synthesizing control not sourced in history, but from the present. Against this, a process of reassemblage and remontage would work to hold the web of intellectual work and conditions of production, his phrase, in a productive tension. This, he argues, is, and I quote him again, the only valid parameter for recomposing the mosaic from the pieces that come from analytical decomposition, close quote. This process of constructing and questioning is dialectical. Deconstruction and construction, destruction and recomposition, the particular and the trajectory, the fragment and the narrative, all these pairings holding history accountable to itself and to the irreconcilable relationship between the world as such and the world that architecture constructs for itself. This process, he suggests, offers an apparatus for bridging words and structures, immediate meaning and significance, all with the long view in mind. To what ends is this the case? In 1975, these seem fairly clear and of that moment. That is, to cultivate a dialectic exposing the capitalist division of works as historically illegitimate, and placing architecture into, quoting him, the true and proper structural cycles, close quote, in which architecture participates. These ends may be expressed in terms that we can today hold at some distance, but the test of the methodological legitimacy he offers is, I think, something more enduring. Does the method hold for history beyond the specific ends, in his case, the specific political ends to which it is first used? Tafuri is alert to the danger of entering a closed system in which a critique of architectural ideology might be played out as a mirror game, simulating criticality as a reflex within rigorously defended ideological confines. Where the critique of ideology might be similarly confined as a critical value brought to bear upon the study of history, the historian, he writes, has to enter, quote, the enchanted castle of ideological forms equipped with an effective antidote. The enchanted castle of ideological forms equipped with an effective antidote. I hardly needed to announce the quotation, I guess. The job then is to construct frames for historical evidence while at the same time undermining them, always undermining them, to identify where disjunctions occur between ideological systems underpinning production and those informing reception. Those moments permitting a blinkered view of the world which become the target of fresh historical investigation once identified. This presupposes a real past, of course, or a past reality, perhaps to put it differently, and admits that in committing history to the page or to the exhibition hall or to the lecture theatre is to make something shaped by inevitably unknowable values first present, and then once present to make them legible. The work, or the historical evidence, is a given, but it is also an index for a range of competing ideological and linguistic systems that are at once traceable and lost. Through the operations of remontage and critical reconstruction, as he puts it, any work becomes open to three instrumental maneuvers. One, progressively extrapolating the work's perceived values as grounds for moving towards the future, as propaganda. Secondly, regressively returning to myths of a better past as historicism, and we've seen examples of both of these in going back to the 1960s. Or thirdly, as a reformational ideology that anticipates, and I quote, new modes of production at a different structure of the division of labor, close quote. Historians therefore need to demonstrate the same degree of intellectual mobility as pervades the work under their critical purview. We also need to admit, that the concept of architecture, as he wrote in Teoria Historia, is constructed and abandoned moment by moment in history, which has direct implications, it follows, for the availability of any piece of evidence. Synthesis will always be fundamentally artificial, which makes history always artificial, which makes it subject to the kind of questions that he insists the historian must always ask of their own work and that of others. This likewise would have institutional consequences if its implications are seen right to the end. And let me add, it should determine as well what we do with Tafuri's own work in the present day as a basis for a new historiography beyond the kind of homage in which Luca and I and plenty of others from time to time indulge. Conscious of my train, I'm going to skip a bit and perhaps I pick things up in discussion if we need to. To read this essay again, and I'm skirting over, let's say, one page here. To read it again, even selectively, as I have definitely done, is to recall a moment in Tafuri's writing that is wide open to a range of methodological sources, but still bound to problems for both architecture and for history that owe a great deal to the formation described by Luca. There is a risk in overplaying a kind of biographical causality to the sort of methodological reflection. But there is also, again, to reinforce Luca's observations, there is also value in recognizing it as a product of accumulated reading, debate, institutional acculturation, and the kind of firm conviction that is hard won by experience. And from this observation, we doubtless have something to discuss. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So unfortunately, we'll have to a little bit cut the discussion. So I would say, is there at least one really pressing question, either from Zoom or from the auditorium? Okay, Mark.
Thank you for those two fascinating talks. One thing, I've got a kind of linked, I've got two questions which are linked. One thing that really comes through from the early Tafuri is that he has achieved his the distinctive character of his writing. Its kind of vehemence, its color, its satirical figures, the way he stretches the limits of a sentence, let's say. And I couldn't really, I don't really see this as coming from Sartre, nor from Gramsci, for very, very good reasons, obviously, with Gramsci particularly. It seems to me to be quite like some of Marx's own writing, in fact. But the question that I have is to do with that vehemence, you know, the fact that he's attacking almost anything produced by the architectural profession at that time, and yet, of course, he moves into an institutional position. So I'm wondering what happens there as he moves from this position that he's adopted early on into an institutional position of engaging with architecture as it's trained, as it's produced.
Thank you very much for a very good question. Of course, you take into account that we had only 20 minutes, so we couldn't put so many things in the soup. But I will start with the second question regarding his institutional process of institutionalization of his career. He was not alone in these battles. Actually, he followed, and he was followed by a series of actors that were inside the university. You must take into account that the transition between fascism and democracy did not intact the university. Italian university till the middle of the 60s had the same professors like the Italian university of the 1930s. So the young generation that came up was totally exactly as we were talking about the city, the protection of the monuments. The same battles has been done with, so the 1968 in Italy is of course a battle against the similar problems that the students had in France. But also, if in my opinion, also especially because the universities were still occupied by fascist professors, or let's say fascist professors, the continuity from fascism. And all those who got into the university, the young generation, So Aimonino, even Aldo Rossi, and all were actually part of this battle, and they were sponsored by a series of people that were inside the university. One of them was Quaroni, and the other was Ernesto Natter Rogers, the guy that led Casabella for so many years. Regarding the writing, you are absolutely right, absolutely right. This writing does not come in no way from all those sources that I showed on my second or third slide, I don't remember. You have to take into account that the sources of the young Tafuria are multiple, and that in the first writings, he's absolutely not like in the writings of the let's say after 1964, 65. Actually, some of his texts are really very pleasant and very normal to read. And then things start to complicate while progressively he, let's say, finds new myths and new points of reference. And also, I would say that he was very much influenced, maybe the figure that the first really father figure of his career was Argan, no? And Argan, and also, let's say, Enzo Paci, this generation of structuralist, you may say, phenomenologists, etc., of the Italian generation was quite complicated in terms of, so the act of reducing this language into simple and understandable thing is always a very complicated effort.
I mean, let me add to that. I mean, I completely agree with everything Luca has said. We've been busy trying to make translations of work while keeping bad writing as bad writing. I mean, I think part of the complexity of the language depends on the kind of venue he's writing for. So there's a real clear distinction between writing for a venue like Italia Nostra, which clearly has an editor working to help produce the magazine and which therefore simplifies the writing that comes through, and a journal like Comunità, which seems prepared to publish whatever he sends them, and he sits there and types away his almost a stream of consciousness linking from one thought to the next in a way which can be very hard to maintain as a reader. But I think to the more important point of how he maintains this antagonism once he moves into his position, I remain convinced that the structural diagram that he describes, I think in Teoria Storia, that the job of the historian is to be in almost constant opposition to the architect, is something that's replicated in the structure of the way that he runs his institute and then department within Venice, to be holding the Department of Progettazione constantly to account. Of course, he has his favorites. Of course, he plays political games at an institutional level. But the structural diagram is very much one of history, not only against architecture, but perpetually holding architecture to account.
Well, thank you so much to both of you. I suggest that if there's anyone else in the audience who would like to have important questions, that you can come to see me. I can communicate maybe your email, and they can just email you. Because I'm really sorry for the technical issue that really messed up the session a bit, but we ended up hearing you. So thank you so much to both of you, and hope to see you again soon.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much.
Ciao.
Thank you, everybody.